Welcome back to Bombastic Nation and Ting and Ting and Ting. Back with some more vibes for all you. I'm Mr. Giant. And in lieu of everything that's going on right now, I decided to watch this just to, just to get a feeling of humankind and how they deal with things and see if there's a trend of that here as of yet. Now, this one is called The First Great Plague and Neolithic Apocalypse. The Black Death, and of course we speaking of the Black Plague and thing like that. You know what I mean? So I want to learn some more about it. You know what I mean? And I want to learn some more about the people that lived through it, or something to that effect. You know what I'm saying and thing. So I ain't gonna talk too much. I am gonna go ahead and YouTube and simmer. Come simmer with me. Let's go.
In the middle of the 14th century AD, the Black Death swept across Eurasia and killed perhaps 200 million people, changing the course of history. But this was not the first time this disease had struck humanity. A new study has suggested that 5,000 years ago, Neolithic Europe was brought to its knees by a plague that allowed the western steppe herders to migrate almost unopposed into emptied lands, bringing about the transition to the Bronze Age. I'm Dan Davis, I'm a novelist, and on this channel I talk about the real history behind my fictional stories. And this is the story of the First Great Plague. The medieval Black Death was caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, which was endemic in rodents in the east and was brought west along trade routes into the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. The European people had no resistance to this new pathogen, and it was so astonishingly, bafflingly deadly that in some places the mortality rate was 50%. No other plague has come close to that. Sometimes whole families were wiped out, whole villages even. A handful of survivors drifting away, leaving empty houses that would never be reoccupied. Many people found themselves completely alone in the world, all their loved ones gone in just a few days. It's difficult for us to even imagine it. The Black Death resulted in enormous social changes. It's been linked to the end of serfdom and the beginning of the rise of the commoner that led ultimately to the modern world. So it's got a lot to answer for.
That's interesting because even at these times with this going on here, there is going to be social changes. There's going to be changes as far as industry is concerned. I think like food being delivered is going to be more prominent. I think that a lot of workers might get replaced with automated stuff, you know what I mean? Because, if the workers get sick and they go home, there's nobody to work. But if they put a robot or something in there, that's going to usher in all of that. It's already in there. It's going to be quickened, I should say. You know what I mean? Things from the Black Plague still linger from now, like old sayings, old nursery rhymes and stuff. People don't do nursery rhymes anymore, but guaranteed there's going to be music coming out with people talking about it. Right now, nobody's doing that. I don't think anybody wants to. Too soon. It's too soon, more than likely. But, here's something I was thinking the other day. It's like Mother Nature knows, man. Mother Nature knows. This thing hit when everybody is divided politically and everything is made into a political issue instead of a human issue. Like, this is a human issue, but they politicized it. It's like Mother Nature, now is the time that people could become so divided and believe in such conspiratorial stuff. Now is the time to hit them. Because some ain't gonna follow protocol, and it's just gonna keep manifesting and getting worse and getting worse. Hopefully not. But the thing is, keeps mutating. However, if people just chill out and do the right thing and take the right precautions and actually believe that this thing is here. Now the question is, I wonder if back then there were people saying it's a hoax and it's not real. You know what I mean? And at what point did they go, oh, this is real? Is it after 200 million people died or coming close to that number? You know what I'm saying? But, there's going to be social changes. because of this. We might not see it, and it's going to affect us more subconsciously than consciously, because we're going to be doing things that is a result of what's happening now. And I'm not talking politically, I'm talking about in everyday life. Now let's keep going with this here.
After the initial plague, there were many more plagues through later centuries, some more deadly than others, some more localized than others. Some plagues affected children more, others older people, and so on. Gradually, it became less deadly. Populations built up resistance, hygiene improved, and possibly other diseases took its place in the pathogenic ecology. Now, the Black Death was not actually the first historically recorded plague. This was in fact the terrible Plague of Justinian, which was between AD 541 to 549, and that one persisted until the 8th century AD. We don't know quite how bad it was, but it might have killed something like 20% of the people in the Roman Empire as it was then, killing thousands a day.
I bet they wish they had a vaccine then.
And we know that this is the same disease as the Black Death in medieval Europe, because a few years ago, researchers dug up bodies from both periods and extracted the genetic material of Yersinia pestis. And now, new studies have shown that Yersinia pestis was in fact present in Europe thousands of years earlier. The most ancient case of plague in humans was found in the body of a young woman from the funnel-beaker culture who died in about 3000 BC in Sweden. Be sure to watch my video on the funnel-beaker culture.
Check out his videos.
This young woman's remains were in a passage grave in Sweden. So the researchers tested the other remains in that grave and found Yersinia pestis in one other person's remains, which dated from the same period. The researchers also tested remains of the pitted ware hunter-gatherers from that same region. I've got a video on the pitted ware people too. They're fascinating people. Anyway, they found no plague in these contemporary nearby hunter-gatherers. The researchers reckon that the plague was spreading within the settled farmer communities, but not in the groups that had a lower population density. By performing various genetic analyses of these ancient samples, the researchers concluded that there was a large-scale branching and geographic spreading of Yersinia pestis between about 4000 BC and 3000 BC. Now, this is during what has been termed the Neolithic decline, and this is shortly before the massive migrations from the steppe into Europe. Significantly though, this paper points out that the spread of the disease was not linked to any migrations. Mass movements of people did not spread the disease. The disease came first, and the migrations happened after. In fact, they date the location and timing of the disease to the decline of the Cucuteni Tripilia culture. As I said in my video about this really amazing Eastern European civilization, they built the largest settlement in human history up to that point. The fall of this civilization has been linked to all kinds of events like climate change, invasion, political instability, and ecological collapse. And we know that stressed populations in high density communities are the ideal conditions for plague epidemics and pandemics, just like with the medieval Black Death. Now, look, I'm very sorry about this, but we need to talk a bit about how it kills people, just for a minute. There were 3 ways that you could get it. Famously, there's the bubonic plague. This disease attacks your lymph nodes and gives you all the signs of a massive infection. High fever, painful, aching joints, nausea and vomiting, and just feeling pretty bloody ill, basically. And this is the one that produces those large, disgusting black lumps around the lymph nodes in the armpits, neck and groin that were filled with revolting, foul pus and infected blood.
Wow.
These were as big as an egg, as big as an apple, actually. By the end, people would be vomiting blood. If you got the bubonic plague, there was an 80% chance of death. You would probably suffer like this for between 2 and 7 days. And that is the mildest form of the disease.
Wow.
The next worst is the pneumonic plague. This is where the disease infects the lungs. It starts with coughing up blood, and within 2 or 3 days the blood just pours from the mouth until you die. It had a mortality rate of 90 to 95%. And the worst one of all, or maybe the best one actually, depending on how you look at it, is the septicemic plague. That's when the blood gets infected with Yersinia pestis. I'm sure we're all familiar with septicemia. There are accounts from the Black Death of people going to bed healthy one night and their husband or wife rolling over in the morning to find them stone dead, their flesh head to toe entirely black and necrotic. It could be that fast. Mortality
Wow.
rate was basically
100%. Wow.
One of my novels, Vampire Night, takes place during the Black Death. Anyway, so remember all that while we go back to the Neolithic. And it was only when Yersinia pestis found itself in densely populated, possibly unhealthy proto-cities that it turned into a plague and then spread through Europe all the way to Sweden and possibly beyond. Because was it perhaps also responsible for the massive collapse in population that I mentioned in my Neolithic Britain video? They don't suggest that in this paper, and so far, as far as I know, there's no evidence of the plague found in Britain from this date. And it would have had to have crossed from the Cucutani to the funnel beakers to the Britons very quickly, but the dates do potentially match if we allow for margins of error. But hold on a moment. If the bacteria spread because of high population density and a stressed population, then why did it spread through Eastern Europe into Northern Europe at all? Because the funnel beaker people didn't live in enormous proto-cities. They lived in small villages and family farmsteads, very small villages. Well, the researchers suggest that the disease might have been spread at ceremonial gathering places like causewayed enclosures, and I discussed them in my Neolithic Britain video. So the idea is that the disease exploded in the urban centres of the Cucutani Tripilia culture and spread through the neighbouring globular amphora culture and into the funnel beaker culture, and maybe beyond. I mentioned in my video on the stone battle axe that the funnel beaker people were trading with the cultures on the Dnieper, and so we know that they had trade links across Europe, which would have enabled this spread. But there's another problem, isn't there? We know that diseases can and do become more and less deadly over time. And just because Yersinia pestis was found in these bodies, it doesn't mean it caused some kind of horrific disease like Black Death, like the bubonic plague, liquefying people in just a few days or even a few hours. Well, this paper addresses that too. They reckon that finding Yersinia pestis DNA in human teeth is a strong sign that it was, in fact, deadly. And the genes of these strains also suggest that it was the pneumonic plague, the one that infected the lungs with a mortality rate over 90%. There's another piece of evidence that I didn't talk about yet, and I didn't talk about it much in my Cucutani Tripilia video either, but the Cucutani Tripilia people really liked periodically burning down their own houses. This is actually quite a famous aspect of their civilization.
Interesting.
In fact, it was this practice that led to a lot of the material culture being preserved in their remains. The Cucutani Tripilia houses were timber, but the floor and walls were covered with clay. The excavations of their cities reveal these thick clay deposits, so it's great for keeping their artifacts in great condition. But it actually made burning the houses difficult. And from experimental archaeology, we know that they had to add a lot of extra fuel around the houses to get them to burn down. So it definitely wasn't accidental. It took a lot of effort to burn these homes to the ground, which they did about every 60 years or so before rebuilding a new home on top or nearby. The question has long been, but why? Of course, there is the ritual explanation. You know, they say it's something to do with their cycles of life and death, and they're ritually killing the house every 3 generations or something like that. And there are more mundane explanations, like the houses just get too old to keep repairing and so they have to start again. Prehistoric houses are often demolished when they get too old. However, burning is very specific, isn't it? They could just tear them down, but they don't, they burn them. And from the start, archaeologists have proposed that they were burned down to get rid of disease. Even before plague was suspected, the archaeologists suggested that it was some kind of pest control or disease control response, due in part to the density of the population. All things considered, I think the weight of evidence suggests that plague...
See, a lot of things are attributed to ritualistic things when quite possibly it was just common sense things. But in order to get people to do it, they link it to something else, to their belief system. It's easier to get them to do it that way. So while we here struggling to figure out whether it's ritualistic, or just something that needs to be done to expel something, or to stop the spread of some kind of contagious diseases or something. You know what I mean? But so the more you live, the more you realize a lot of the things that is said was said for a specific reason, for a specific time period. And that's kind of cool to figure out, you know what I mean? For the circumstances in a certain time period, you know. And it's probably something that they kept up for centuries, you know what I mean? Especially if they had the plague there, they probably kept it up every 3 generations, burn the house, to burn, you might say to burn evil spirits, but it's but then again, disease probably was considered an evil spirit back then too. Still does to a certain degree in these times. Let's keep going.
Of the population. All things considered, I think the weight of evidence suggests that plague was a serious problem for the Kikutani Tripilia people at the very least. And this perhaps helps to explain why these massive cities were abandoned after a few centuries. Maybe the Kikutani Tripilia would have become a great, enduring, urban civilization. The final Beaker culture also had a period of decline that led to the expansion of the pitted ware culture. We don't know exactly what caused this decline. It's always climate change or over-farming, but perhaps the introduction of plague had a drastic impact in Northern Europe too. So is that wider narrative true then? Did the plague cause the Neolithic decline in Europe, paving the way for the steppe herders to move in and take it over? Well, we should be careful when assigning causes to prehistoric events, shouldn't we? You see this kind of thing in the historiography of the later Bronze Age collapse, where notoriously different generations of scholars assign the cause that happens to reflect their own times. So in the early 20th century, you might see massive warfare and invasions emphasised. And in the Cold War, they started describing the late Bronze Age as a time of powerful expansionist superstates holding one another in check before the inherent weaknesses of the economic systems collapsed inward. And from the 70s, you see them talking about climate change. And after the internet era, they talk about networks and globalization. You get what I'm saying? Our analysis of these kinds of events often says as much about us as it does about prehistory. That's not to say any of those interpretations are wrong, by the way. They're probably all correct. Reality is so complicated and cause and effect is so hard to work out that really you can use the evidence to construct almost any narrative you like without it ever being wrong. There are many other variables that contributed to the Neolithic decline and the coming of the Bronze Age. The overexploitation of resources, climate change, or some sort of inherent cultural degeneration, and technological developments coming from the south and the east, like an abundance of copper tools and weapons, or wagons and horse riding, maybe. I considered including this Neolithic period plague in my Gods of Bronze series to explain the steppe herder migrations. But in the end, I went with devastation caused by a race of giant immortals from the Paleolithic. It's a fantasy series, so I can do that if I want to. But in the real world, we know that there wasn't some complete depopulation that led to an empty landmass. And to be clear, that isn't what this paper suggests at all. It has highly respectable archaeologist co-authors like Christian Christensen, and we know there was no mass depopulation because although the male lineages of Neolithic Europe mostly ended, the lineages of Neolithic European women continued. That surely speaks to the patriarchal steppe herder influence more than anything, like I talk about in the Kurios videos. Unless, of course, this late Neolithic variant of the plague killed way more men than women, which is a possibility, I suppose.
Yeah, it's
accurate to say, I think, that the Neolithic decline likely had a number of causes, but one of them was surely the spread of the pneumonic plague. That wasn't the end of prehistoric plagues either. Yersinia pestis has been found in Bronze Age sites right across Eurasia in later Indo-European cultures, like the corded ware in the Eastern Baltic, the Unitica culture in Central Europe, and the Sinsashta, Andronovo, and Afananciovo cultures on the other side of the steppe. Just how much of an impact this disease had on those Bronze Age cultures is difficult to say right now, but it's clear that this horrible little bacterium has been changing the course of human history since the very start of European civilization. Thanks to my patrons for supporting the channel. Please help me out by clicking like.
Yeah, I'll leave a link in the description to this. Go check out this dude's channel. Looks like he's got some interesting stuff. I haven't checked it out myself, but I'm gonna go look because seems like he's going into specific tribes and things like that. So I'm gonna go check that out. Y'all go check it out too. And you know what I mean? Y'all take care of each other, alright? Cool runnings.